The gentle hum of Terminal 4 at LAX filled the air as morning sunlight streamed through the towering glass windows. It was just another Tuesday in June, or at least that's what everyone thought. Among the sea of travelers rushing to their gates, a woman in a crisp navy blazer and matching pencil skirt stood checking her phone one last time before her flight. Mrs. Patel, a successful marketing executive with 12 years of experience under her belt, had made this cross-country journey countless times before. At 34, she had mastered the art of business travel, her carry-on packed perfectly, her laptop fully charged, and her boarding pass ready in her digital wallet. Her colleagues often joked about how she could probably navigate LAX blindfolded. That morning, she had kissed her husband goodbye at 5 a.m., promising to video call him and their 2 kids once she landed in New York. Just another quick business trip, she had said with a confident smile. Little did she know that this routine flight would soon become the center of a national conversation about passenger rights and airline accountability. The first signs of trouble appeared subtle. A slight delay notification on the boarding screen. Mrs. Patel barely looked up from her laptop as she responded to last-minute emails. After all, minor delays were part of the game when it came to air travel. She took another sip of her green tea, reviewing presentation slides for her upcoming meeting with potential investors. Around her, the terminal buzzed with its usual energy. A young couple shared earphones while watching something on their phone. An elderly gentleman dozed in his wheelchair while his daughter kept a watchful eye, and a group of teenagers excitedly discussed their upcoming graduation trip. The scene painted a perfect picture of ordinary airport life, the kind we've all experienced countless times. The second delay announcement came through the speakers, causing a few passengers to look up with mild concern. Mrs. Patel checked her watch. She had built in a buffer for delays, but this was starting to eat into her New York schedule. She opened her calendar app, already mentally rearranging her meetings. A child's laughter echoed through the terminal as a toddler played peekaboo with another waiting passenger. The sound brought a smile to Mrs. Patel's face, reminding her of her own little ones at home. She pulled out her phone to send them a quick message, letting them know she might be a bit late for their planned video call. The gate agent's desk started drawing more attention as passengers approached with questions about connecting flights. The agent, a woman with kind eyes and a tired smile, answered each query with practiced patience. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder with each passing minute. Then came the gate change announcement. Passengers gathered their belongings, some sighing, others muttering under their breath. Mrs. Patel packed up her laptop, straightened her blazer, and joined the migration to the new gate. The wheels of her carry-on clicked against the terminal floor, adding to the symphony of rolling luggage surrounding her. As she walked, she overheard fragments of conversations. Business people rescheduling meetings, families discussing dinner plans, and tourists worried about hotel check-ins. Each story unique, yet connected by the shared experience of travel uncertainty. The new gate area was more crowded, with fewer available seats. Mrs. Patel found a spot near a charging station, claiming it with relief. She pulled out her phone again, this time to check the weather in New York. The forecast showed clear skies, nothing that should cause delays. What happened next would transform this ordinary travel day into something none of the passengers could have anticipated. As the third delay announcement crackled through the speakers, the atmosphere in Terminal 4 shifted. The collective patience of 200 travelers began to wear thin, and Mrs. Patel felt something change inside her as well. The events that would unfold in the next few hours would not only change her life, but would spark a nationwide conversation about air travel rights and human dignity. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Terminal 4 as the situation slowly unraveled. What had started as a minor inconvenience was morphing into something far more serious. Mrs. Patel watched as fellow passengers began pacing the gate area, their faces showing increasing signs of frustration. The clock on the wall seemed to mock them all, its hands moving painfully slow. A businessman in his 50s kept checking his watch, mumbling about a missed conference. Next to him, a young mother tried to entertain her restless twins with a tablet that was quickly running out of battery. The gate area had become a pressure cooker of emotions, with each passing hour adding another layer of tension to the already strained atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen," the gate agent's voice crackled through the speaker, causing everyone to look up hopefully. "We apologize for the continued delay. Our maintenance team is still working on resolving the mechanical issue." The collective sigh of disappointment was almost audible. But it was what came next that turned the situation on its head. "Unfortunately, we've determined that the repair will require overnight maintenance. We're working to arrange accommodations for all passengers." The words hung in the air for a moment before chaos erupted. People jumped to their feet, voices raised in protest. Mrs. Patel felt her heart sink as she thought about her crucial morning meeting in New York. An elderly couple sitting nearby began frantically calling their son, who was supposed to pick them up at JFK. A group of college students huddled together, calculating if they could afford an unplanned hotel stay. The gate agent's desk quickly became surrounded by a crowd of anxious travelers, each person trying to make their voice heard above the others. Mrs. Patel stood up, her legs stiff from sitting so long. She had been patient, understanding even, through the first 3 delays. But this was different. Her presentation tomorrow could make or break $1 million deal. She had prepared for weeks, coordinated with teams across 2 time zones, and arranged childcare for her kids. The thought of it all falling apart because of poor airline management made something shift inside her. The line to speak with a gate agent snaked through the waiting area. People shared stories of missed weddings, important business meetings, and family emergencies. A young man talked about his grandmother's 80th birthday celebration he would now miss. Each story added another brick to the wall of collective frustration building in Terminal 4. Mrs. Patel pulled out her phone, trying to find alternative flights. But with over 200 displaced passengers all searching at once, available seats disappeared before her eyes. The airline's customer service number returned only a busy signal. Their app crashed repeatedly under the sudden surge of traffic. A child's cry pierced the air, and Mrs. Patel looked up to see the young mother from earlier trying to console one of her twins. Without thinking, she reached into her bag and pulled out her emergency granola bar, offering it to the stressed parent. The small act of kindness created a moment of connection amidst the chaos. As the minutes ticked by, Mrs. Patel noticed more passengers helping each other. People shared phone chargers, snacks, and travel tips. An off-duty pilot stuck in the crowd explained the mechanical issue to worried passengers, helping them understand the safety implications. These small moments of humanity stood in stark contrast to the growing tension. But when the airline staff began packing up their equipment at the gate desk, something changed in the atmosphere. The realization hit everyone at once: they were being left to fend for themselves. Mrs. Patel felt her professional demeanor, carefully cultivated over years in corporate America, begin to crack. She looked around at the faces of her fellow passengers, the elderly couple who had been traveling since dawn, the young mother trying to keep it together, the businessman who had already missed his conference. In that moment, she made a decision that would alter not just her evening, but the entire landscape of passenger rights in American aviation. Little did anyone know that the next few minutes would be captured by dozens of cell phones, shared thousands of times on social media, and eventually make headlines across the country. The events about to unfold would force everyone to question the balance between passenger rights and airline protocols, and Mrs. Patel would find herself at the center of it all. The fluorescent lights of Terminal 4 seemed to buzz louder as Mrs. Patel made her way to the gate counter. Her heels clicked against the floor, each step carrying the weight of hundreds of frustrated passengers behind her. She had spent the last 15 years building her reputation as a level-headed professional, but sometimes enough was simply enough. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but firm. The gate agent looked up, exhaustion evident in her eyes. Around them, passengers had their phones out, some recording, others still desperately trying to book alternative flights. The young mother with twins had finally gotten both children to sleep in their stroller, and the elderly couple sat holding hands, worry etched on their faces. "We need more than just an apology," Mrs. Patel continued, placing her boarding pass on the counter. "There are people here who can't afford an unexpected hotel stay. There's a man who's missing his grandmother's birthday, children who need proper beds to sleep in, and business deals that could collapse." The gate agent started her rehearsed response about weather conditions and mechanical issues, but Mrs. Patel raised her hand politely. "I understand the flight can't take off. What I don't understand is why there's no concrete plan to help us. We've been here for 7 hours." More passengers gathered around, their presence lending silent support to her words. A middle-aged teacher stepped forward, adding his voice. "My students have a field trip tomorrow. I need to be there." Others began sharing their stories, each one adding to the growing tension in the air. The security cameras would later show what happened next. How Mrs. Patel pulled out her tablet and started reading airline regulations aloud. She had spent the last hour researching passenger rights while waiting in line. Her marketing background kicked in as she organized the crowd's complaints into clear, actionable points. "According to your own policy," she said, her voice carrying across the terminal, "in cases of mechanical delays exceeding 4 hours, passengers are entitled to meal vouchers and hotel accommodations." She held up her tablet, showing the airline's website. More phones came out, recording the confrontation. A young tech professional in the crowd started live streaming the scene. The elderly gentleman's daughter began translating everything into Spanish for a group of confused international travelers. The terminal had transformed into a kind of impromptu town hall, with Mrs. Patel unexpectedly at its center. The airline staff huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. More security personnel appeared at the edges of the crowd, their presence both reassuring and concerning. Mrs. Patel noticed them but continued speaking, her voice never rising above a conversational level. "We're not asking for anything unreasonable," she explained, making eye contact with each staff member. "We just want the basic respect and assistance we're entitled to as paying customers." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone started a slow clap, which quickly died down as a supervisor approached the desk. What happened next would be debated on social media for weeks to come. The security footage would be analyzed frame by frame, but it couldn't capture the emotions in the air. Mrs. Patel's next words, spoken clearly and calmly, would become a rallying cry for passenger rights advocates across the country. "If you can't help us," she said, reaching into her bag, "then I need to speak with someone who can." She pulled out a business card, one that would later prove crucial in the investigation. The supervisor's reaction to that simple piece of paper set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. The next 3 minutes were captured from 17 different angles by passengers' phones. The security cameras caught another view, and the airport's internal communication system recorded everything else. But none of the recordings could fully capture the shock that rippled through the crowd when the first security officer stepped forward. Mrs. Patel stood her ground, dignity intact, as the situation escalated beyond anyone's expectations. Her words, "I'm not leaving until every person here is taken care of," would be quoted in newspapers across the country. The events that followed would raise serious questions about passenger rights, corporate responsibility, and the thin line between maintaining order and respecting human dignity. Time seemed to slow down in Terminal 4 as 3 airport security officers approached the gate counter. The overhead lights cast strange shadows across the scene, making everything feel slightly surreal. Mrs. Patel remained standing at the counter, her tablet still displaying the airline's passenger rights webpage. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the counter," the first officer said, his voice professional but firm. The crowd of passengers had grown silent, phones still recording, creating an eerie quiet broken only by the distant sound of airport announcements and a baby's soft cry. The young mother with twins watched nervously, clutching her stroller. The elderly couple who had been waiting since dawn stood up slowly, the husband supporting his wife. The businessman who had missed his conference moved closer to the front, his earlier frustration now replaced with concern. "I'm simply requesting the airline follow its own published policies." Mrs. Patel replied calmly, her voice steady. She held up her tablet again, pointing to specific paragraphs. "Everything I'm asking for is documented right here. 200 people need help, and nobody is giving us answers." The second security officer stepped forward, speaking into his radio. More passengers were gathering now, forming a loose circle around the scene. The tech professional who had been live streaming adjusted his position to get a better angle. His viewer count had jumped from a few dozen to several thousand in the last 10 minutes. "Look around," Mrs. Patel continued, gesturing to the crowd. "There's a teacher who needs to be there for his students tomorrow. There's a young man missing his grandmother's birthday. There are families who can't afford unexpected hotel stays. We're not being unreasonable." The supervisor behind the counter was on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. The gate agent looked increasingly uncomfortable, glancing between Mrs. Patel and the security officers. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch. Then something unexpected happened. The elderly gentleman who had been waiting all day stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "Officers," he said, his voice carrying years of experience. "I've been flying with this airline for 40 years. What's happening today isn't right." More voices joined in, not shouting but speaking firmly. The teacher talked about his student's field trip. A nurse described her upcoming hospital shift. Each story added another layer to the situation, transforming it from a simple security issue into something more significant. Mrs. Patel stood her ground, but never raised her voice or made any threatening moves. She simply kept pointing to the airline's policies on her tablet, requesting assistance for every stranded passenger. The security footage would later show how she maintained a professional demeanor throughout the entire interaction. The third officer reached for his radio, and that's when the atmosphere shifted. The crowd moved closer, not aggressively, but protectively. Phones captured every angle as the officer's hand moved from his radio to his belt. Later, these videos would be analyzed frame by frame on news broadcasts across the country. "Please," Mrs. Patel said, her voice finally showing a hint of emotion. "We're not causing trouble. We just want help." The young mother's baby started crying again, the sound echoing through the terminal. Someone in the crowd began recording the names of every passenger present, creating a list of witnesses. The next 60 seconds would become the most watched airport video of the year. Mrs. Patel's composed response to the officer's next actions would be studied in customer service training sessions and law enforcement seminars. Nobody in Terminal 4 that evening could have predicted how those brief moments would change airline policies forever. As the officers moved to physically remove her from the counter, Mrs. Patel made one final statement. Her words, captured by dozens of cameras and later quoted in congressional hearings, were simple but powerful. Sometimes standing up for what's right means standing still. The events that followed would spark a national debate about passenger rights, corporate responsibility, and the use of authority in public spaces. The video started spreading across social media before Mrs. Patel even reached the airport police station. The young tech professional's live stream had already gathered over 50,000 viewers, and clips were being shared at lightning speed. The quiet night shift at LAX's Terminal 4 had suddenly become the center of a viral storm. Back at the gate, the remaining passengers refused to leave. The elderly couple who had witnessed everything sat firmly in their seats, the husband holding his wife's hand. The young mother with twins found support from fellow travelers who helped her with her bags and children. The businessman who had earlier complained about his missed conference now stood guard over everyone's abandoned luggage. I was there. People began posting online. "You won't believe how they treated her." The teacher who had spoken up about his field trip started a thread detailing every minute of the incident. His careful observations would later become crucial evidence. Outside the terminal, news vans began arriving, their satellite dishes reaching into the dark sky. Inside the police station, Mrs. Patel sat quietly, her blazer slightly wrinkled, but her dignity intact. The officers were surprised by her calmness as she asked to call her family. Her husband, watching the viral videos from home, had already contacted their family lawyer. Their 2 children slept peacefully, unaware that their mother was about to become the face of a movement. #JusticeSceneTerminal4 started trending within hours. The airline's social media team scrambled to respond as thousands of comments flooded their pages. Past passengers began sharing their own stories of airline mistreatment, creating a tidal wave of public support for the woman who dared to stand up for everyone's rights. The young tech professional who had live-streamed everything found his video being picked up by major news networks. His careful documentation of Mrs. Patel's calm requests and the airline's responses painted a clear picture that resonated with millions. She never raised her voice, he told reporters. She just stood there asking them to help everyone. By midnight, the story had reached the East Coast. The airline's corporate office in Atlanta received thousands of calls. Their customer service lines were overwhelmed with people demanding answers. The next morning's newspapers were already preparing their headlines, each trying to capture the significance of what had happened in Terminal 4. Back at the airport, something remarkable was happening. The stranded passengers, instead of dispersing, formed a community. They shared phone chargers, snacks, and stories. The teacher organized a list of everyone's needs and contact information. The businessman used his corporate connections to arrange hotel rooms for families with children. Mrs. Patel's tablet, still displaying the airline's policy page, had been photographed countless times. Legal experts began appearing on news shows, pointing out how the airline had failed to follow its own guidelines. Consumer rights advocates seized the moment, calling for industry-wide reforms. Social media buzzed with witness accounts. The elderly couple's daughter, who had translated everything into Spanish, shared her perspective in a viral Twitter thread. The young mother wrote a touching Facebook post about how Mrs. Patel had offered her last granola bar to her hungry twins hours before the incident. Security camera footage from multiple angles was requested by news organizations. Each new view seemed to strengthen Mrs. Patel's case. The calm professionalism she showed, even as she was being led away, struck a chord with millions who had experienced similar frustrations with air travel. By sunrise, the incident had sparked a national conversation. Television morning shows led with the story, showing clips that had now been viewed millions of times. Transportation experts, civil rights lawyers, and customer service specialists all weighed in, turning one woman's stand into a catalyst for change. What started as a simple flight delay had evolved into something much bigger. Mrs. Patel's quiet dignity in the face of injustice resonated with people around the world. Her story was becoming a symbol of standing up for what's right, proving that sometimes the most powerful acts of resistance are the quietest ones. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the downtown law office as Mrs. Patel sat across from her attorney, watching him review the mounting evidence. 3 weeks had passed since the Terminal 4 incident, but its impact continued to grow. On his computer screen, a playlist of witness videos played silently, each showing a different angle of that fateful evening. "Look at this," the lawyer said, pointing to his tablet. "We've received statements from over 50 passengers." He scrolled through emails from the elderly couple, the young mother with twins, the tech professional who live-streamed everything, and dozens more. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, painting a picture of systematic issues within the airline industry. Outside the office, reporters camped in the lobby, hoping for updates. The story had struck a chord with the public in a way nobody expected. Mrs. Patel's calm demeanor in the face of injustice had become a symbol for everyone who had ever felt powerless against big corporations. Her phone buzzed with another message from the teacher who had been there that night. He'd have started a support group for the Terminal 4 passengers, and they met weekly to share updates and offer encouragement. The businessman who had missed his conference now attended every meeting, bringing coffee and donuts for everyone. There's something else, her lawyer said, pulling up another document. We found similar incidents at the same terminal over the past year. He showed her reports of other passengers who had faced similar treatment, their stories buried under paperwork and corporate responses. The airline's pattern of behavior was becoming clear. The young tech professional's video had now been viewed over 10 million times. News channels played clips during their coverage of the growing movement for passenger rights. His careful documentation of Mrs. Patel's reasonable requests and the airline's responses had become key evidence in the case. At home, Mrs. Patel's family adapted to their new reality. Her children proudly told their friends how their mother stood up for what was right. Her husband fielded calls from support groups and advocacy organizations, all wanting to help. Their quiet family life had transformed into something bigger than themselves. The airline's internal investigation revealed surprising details. Emails between staff members showed a history of ignoring their own policies when it came to stranded passengers. The tablet screen showing the airline's guidelines, which Mrs. Patel had held up that night, became a crucial piece of evidence. Support poured in from unexpected places. Former airline employees began sharing their stories, describing the pressure to cut corners and ignore passenger rights. The elderly couple's daughter, who had translated during the incident, started a multilingual website helping international travelers understand their rights. Mrs. Patel's workplace stood firmly behind her. Her boss had seen the videos and recognized the same professional demeanor she brought to client meetings. They provided character references and full support for her legal battle, understanding that this fight was about more than one delayed flight. The airline's legal team requested a private meeting. In a downtown conference room, they presented their initial offer, a significant sum meant to end the story quietly. Mrs. Patel listened politely, then did something that would once again catch her public attention. She refused. "This isn't about money," she told them, her voice firm but kind. "This is about making sure no one else goes through what we experienced." Her response, leaked to social media, sparked another wave of support. People shared stories of times they wished they'd had the courage to stand up against unfair treatment. Consumer protection agencies began investigations into airline practices nationwide. Mrs. Patel's case had opened a door, revealing systemic issues that had been ignored for years. The young mother's viral post about Mrs. Patel's kindness with the granola bar had humanized the story, showing that standing up for rights didn't mean losing compassion. Transportation experts appeared on television, explaining how this case could change airline policies forever. The quiet dignity Mrs. Patel showed in Terminal 4 had started a conversation that was growing louder every day, proving that sometimes the biggest changes start with one person simply doing what's right. 3 months after the Terminal 4 incident, Mrs. Patel stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a congressional committee on air passenger rights. The room was packed with familiar faces. The elderly couple sat in the front row. The young mother with her now slightly bigger twins watched from the gallery, and the tech professional who captured everything on video sat ready to testify. "This was never about one delayed flight," she began, her voice steady and clear. "It was about dignity, respect, and doing what's right." Behind her, screens displayed photos from that evening. Snapshots of frustrated travelers who had become an unexpected family, united by circumstance and compassion. The airline's CEO had arrived early that morning, prepared to announce sweeping changes to their passenger policies. The pressure from millions of social media posts, countless news stories, and ongoing investigations had finally forced meaningful action. But the real victory wasn't in the corporate response. It was in the movement that had grown from that night in Terminal 4. The teacher who had been there that night now ran a successful passenger advocacy group. From his classroom after school hours, he helped stranded travelers understand their rights. The businessman who had missed his conference had become one of the group's biggest donors, turning his initial frustration into positive change. Mrs. Patel's children watched the proceedings from home with their father, proud of how their mother had turned a moment of injustice into a force for good. Their kitchen table, once covered with legal documents, now hosted meetings for a new passenger rights organization that Mrs. Patel had helped establish. The settlement, when it finally came, went far beyond monetary compensation. The airline agreed to complete overhaul of their delay policies, better training for staff, and clear communication protocols. But more importantly, they committed to creating a passenger advocacy board, with Mrs. Patel invited as one of its founding members. Remember the granola bar? The young mother had asked during a recent support group meeting. That simple act of kindness had become symbolic of their shared experience. How humanity could shine through even in difficult moments. Her twins, now toddling around, had become mascots of sorts for their regular gatherings. The elderly couple's daughter continued her work making travel rights information accessible in multiple languages. Her website, inspired by that night of translating in Terminal 4, had grown into a valuable resource for international travelers. Airlines across the country began adopting her translations for their own policies. The tech professional's viral video had evolved into a documentary series about passenger rights and corporate responsibility. Each episode featured stories from different travelers, but they always began with the quiet dignity of one woman standing at an airline counter, asking for nothing more than what was right. Back at her office, Mrs. Patel found her work life forever changed. Clients now saw her as more than a marketing executive. She had become a symbol of standing up for what's right while maintaining professionalism and compassion. Her boss had framed the newspaper article about their final victory, hanging it in the company lobby. The airline industry itself began to shift. Other carriers, seeing the public response to Mrs. Patel's case, proactively improved their passenger policies. The Terminal 4 incident had become a case study in corporate training programs, teaching the importance of human dignity in customer service. As Mrs. Patel concluded her testimony that day in Washington, she looked out at the faces in the crowd, not just the familiar ones from that night, but hundreds of others who had joined their cause. Each person represented a story, a right to dignity, a voice that deserved to be heard. The real turbulence that night wasn't in the air, she said in closing. It was in our willingness to accept being treated as less than human. But when we stood together, we found our strength. The room erupted in applause, not just for her words, but for the movement they had all built together. That evening, as the sun set over the Capitol, the Terminal 4 family gathered for dinner. They shared stories, laughter, and plans for the future. What had started as a group of strangers stranded at an airport had become a powerful force for change, proving that sometimes the most important journeys don't require taking flight at all.